Next, we have on the agenda from none of the above party, Mr. Greg Vezina. He is the leader and president. So we welcome you, sir. How are you today?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Good. So according to the orders from the House, you have 10 minutes for your presentation, followed by 15 minutes of questioning from the party members. Mr. Dillon, to start, comments?
Just wanted to put my name on the list.
Very good. Thank you. So again, you have 10 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Je préfère parler anglais, plus ma français n'est pas très bon.
I'm going to speak in English because my French is not great.
Deputation because my French is not very good. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, Chief Electoral Officer, other people present. I provided the clerk a copy of a book I wrote in 1993 with John Deverell, former Toronto Star reporter, called Democracy, A Guide to Voter Action. This book was endorsed by multiple political parties and leaders from opposite sides, Mike Harris, Julie Davis, Mel Hertig, Judy Rebick. It was the first political book written in Canada where partisans put aside their partisan belief and actually looked at process. Mike Harris's quote was, "Essential reading for anyone who believes that governments no longer serve the people who elect them." Before we get into the specifics of election finance reform, there's some very important point about the right of Ontario's voters that they have to decline their ballot. The process for declining your ballot ignores the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Canada ratified in 1976, because you must do so publicly at the poll. Article 25 of the ICCPR gives every citizen the right to vote and the opportunity without unreasonable restrictions to vote and be elected at genuine periodic elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage and shall be held by secret ballot, guaranteeing free expression of the will of the electors. But to decline your ballot in Ontario, you must publicly just state, "I decline," when the returning officer hands your ballot and you turn it back. This means your ballot's not secret. Everyone with earshot of the polling station knows you exercised your franchise to vote, to not vote, and your right to a secret ballot's lost. Declined ballots are important enough that they're counted separately, and they count towards the subsidies, which mostly go to the major parties. Indeed, if the people that don't vote went out and voted and declined their ballots, nobody would reach the 15% threshold and get subsidies. Very, very few. In 2014 Ontario election, 31,399 voters declined their ballots compared to just over 2,000 in 2011. That was the highest number since it became a legal option in 1975. And none of the above is a growing worldwide movement that, through various mechanisms, allows voters to protest the status quo and or vote for candidates they believe truly represent democracy. In Poland's 1989 election, voters were allowed to cross out the single candidate's name on the ballot, off the ruling Communist Party, and they defeated the Prime Minister and dozens of leading communists. So when people are given a chance to protest, to say they're upset and they'd like something different, they show up in droves and they throw out even single-party governments. In Nevada, the 2014 Democratic gubernatorial primary was won by none of the above, out of all candidates. And the same thing happened to the Republican primary in 1976. In 2014, the Supreme Court of India ordered an option of none of the above on the ballot based on the United Nations Convention for Secret Ballots. And first election, 1.1% of the vote. Not a candidate has actually been elected to Serbian parliament. In some places, none of the above is not a candidate. None of the above is a vote for no party and no candidate. In other places, it's an actual party. In Ontario, the Not a Party supports the 3 R's of direct democracy: citizen-initiated referenda, recall or some form of term limits, and electoral and legislative reforms to bring about transparency, accountability, including the end of corporate and union contributions, and all government partisan advertising. In our debut election, we received just under 1% of the vote in 8 ridings, but 21% of all new votes cast for smaller parties and independents across 107 ridings, and 13% of all new votes cast in the 4 Mississauga ridings we ran in. If this bill contains a provision for voters to vote for none of these candidates, the none of the above party will change its name to something else and allow people a negative option. But there must be one proviso. If none of the above wins the riding, then second place doesn't get appointed. There's a new election, and no candidate or party that field candidates in that election can run in the by-election because they were defeated. Notwithstanding protestations otherwise, there's little doubt about the influence of money in politics. The more public funding available and the less corporate and large wealthy contributors, the more democratic and the less corruption you have. There's been dozens and dozens of studies. I quote a recent OECD study that studied 6 countries and found the same thing. This case studies involve Canada, Chile, Estonia, France, Korea, 8 countries, Mexico, United Kingdom, Brazil, and India. It concluded political finance needs tighter regulation and enforcement, and that many economically advanced countries are failing to fully enforce the regulations of political party financing and campaign donations, or leaving loopholes that can be exploited by powerful special interest groups. And that is the case in this bill, and it's been pointed out. I've seen it today. A similar report by the Australian Institute examined 6 cases where mining companies made donations to Australia's major political parties and received favorable legislation for mining projects in the state of Queensland. Governments in Canada have come to similar conclusions regarding improper influence of corporate and wealthy donors. There's been changes in federal legislation. Quebec's response to the findings of the Carbonneau Commission was to slash the contribution limit to $100, establish matching public funds, which allocates $2.50 for the first $20,000 and $1 for the first $200,000 per party, and cash for access events such as those held in Ontario are prohibited. We agree with the Green Party of Ontario's submission that they like things about the bill with some revisions. We like some things about the bill. There are some great changes proposed here. But we like some, and we agree with them on the revisions, certainly that the legislation should explicitly be clear that paid volunteers are not allowed, because that's a contribution. And any loopholes, as I said, that allow cash for access events should be closed. We shouldn't be able to buy access to politicians. Now, if they want to hold an event and charge you the price of dinner, that's great. But if it's the price of dinner plus a political contribution, I think we should do it. Now, we propose some changes that will deal with some of this. We have our top 10 list. And the first is we believe that the maximum personal contribution should be $1,000. That's it, no more. That's 10 times the contribution in Quebec. We think the Quebec limit is too low. It prohibits people to participate. So $1,000 is reasonable. And we like to make the tax credits more generous for smaller contributions and less generous for larger contributions. And without going through all the numbers, if you give $100, you get $100. If you give $250, you get $212.50. If you give $500, you get $377. And then if you give more than that, you get very, very little back. So if you give $750, you only get $500. And if you give $1,000, you only get $85 more. So what we want to do is encourage people to make small contributions. In the essence, what we learned from the Bernie Sanders campaign, where he went up against the billionaires and the parties and raised as much money, but raised it through small contributions. And so with that in mind, we think that there should be an anonymous contribution that people can make up to $100 on their income tax return, and that the parties don't know who they are, so that people can contribute to the political process and not get on a mailing list and not get inundated with fundraisers and not have who they contributed to published on the internet. $100 won't buy any corruption, but it will buy privacy and it will buy the confidence. So we think that that's an important change. And I noticed a discussion earlier about the $200 limit. So $100 you give, there's no disclosure if you do it on your income tax return. If you give it to the political party, there's a record. We think that you should match these special contributions by 100% to a maximum of $500,000 for a party and $10,000 for a candidate, which means $1 million maximum can be raised this way by a party and $20,000 by candidates. And we believe that all the new or pre-listed registered party or independent candidates should be allowed to pre-register the same way existing party candidates are. Because under the present system, you can pre-register, the writs drop, you can have an all-party debate without the other guys before nominations even open. It's not right. Fine, I've got the end. We think parties and each riding association should get $1,000 every year for the candidate they ran in the previous election, because it costs money to operate riding associations and it costs money to sustain yourself. And a few $1,000s per candidate is not too much to ask, so that you don't have to go out and beg, borrow, steal to get the money just to exist as a party or as a candidate. We think the maximum total annual election subsidy for campaign and these other subsidies is $50,000 for candidates and $2.5 million for parties, and that the per vote subsidy should also exist and that it should be at the same limit. So the total would be $5 million and $100,000 for candidates. And the formula should exist that every cent of it can be raised through contributions or rebates. If you can go out and organize yourself enough, you should be able to fund a $100,000 campaign without personally doing it, paying for it. Finally, we think that you have to look at, now that corporate contributions are illegal, media giving millions of dollars worth of free television time to some political parties and not others becomes an illegal contribution. The regulators have ignored this in Canada, but I can assure you, you're not going to be able to ignore it for much longer. The 10 and 15% threshold is unconstitutional. It was ruled unconstitutional by the federal government after the major parties in Ottawa rigged the election laws on a Friday afternoon and prorogued the House. They were found unconstitutional. The Green Party then went to the government of Ontario and said, listen, this is unconstitutionally federally. Will you please change the rule? The government said, no. Get a lawyer, sue us. We'll see you in the Supreme Court. And he did, and he won. There's something wrong when you have to sue a government to have a law declared unconstitutional provincially when it's already been declared unconstitutionally federally. It's, in fact, an abusive process to make someone sue you to change the rules. You're supposed to comply with the charter, and all legislation before it's drafted is supposed to be vetted to comply with the charter. Finally, we think these changes are absolutely necessary because candidates have a Section 3 right to run, and voters have a Section 3 right to cast an informed vote. And no legislature can overturn those rights. The rights to freedom of the press or freedom of speech or freedom of association or any rights in Section 2 or 6 to 15 can be overturned by Parliament. But the rights to run and the right to inform voters cannot be overturned by anybody, and they are overturned on a daily basis in Canada. Our election commissioners go to other countries to implement election and broadcast rules to make them fair, that comply with the UN rules, for example, equal time, not equitable. And yet in Canada, we allow abuses that only used to exist in the Communist Party in the USSR. Finally, I'd like you to know that I've been fighting this battle since 1981, when I was first kept off a debate, when I ran the first election for the Green Party of Canada. We filed complaints federally, and we filed complaints in Ontario with the Commission on Election Finances. I'm almost done. And they ignored us. So we went to court. New premier got elected. It disbanded the Commission on Election Finances because of bias. The commission was supposed to have a bencher from the Law Society of Upper Canada named. They refused to name one for 7 years before that because of bias of the commission. So the commission was gone. I have a complaint under the Ontario Human Rights Code over the Whitby by-election, where a debate was held with 4 candidates, 2 of which were sitting local council members in the Whitby Town Hall council chambers. I filed complaints. Nobody cares. Well, I can tell you who cares. The courts of Canada care. It's a conflict of interest for a city councillor to be receiving a salary municipally, running in a provincial election, to receive a contribution from City Hall of the benefit of a debate on city property. It's an illegal corporate contribution. No contributions that promote or oppose a candidate are allowed unless they're given to everybody else and declared. We allow millions and millions of dollars in free time given by the media only to major parties, and all the other rules that you have don't matter a hill of beans, because the most important event in the whole campaign is the debate, and the second most important event in the whole campaign is the nightly news. And when the news starts with the three parties and the three leaders in every newscast, and the CRTC refuses to enforce the balance and fairness requirements and the requirements that broadcasters enhance the political fabric of the nation, we have become a banana republic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to start with Mr. Clark.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, sir. I've never heard you speak before, and you're very passionate.
Well, I believe in this
passionate
stuff.
to say the least.
Thank you.
I've got a lot of questions
Shoot.
about many things, but anyway, I'm going to try to stick to one session. So I don't understand how this $100 anonymous donation works. I had asked the question earlier of Mr. Kingsley about the American system where you can basically search, name, address, occupation, employer, and I'm not particularly sure how your $100 would work, that I could give it to, let's say, my party, the Conservative Party, but I wouldn't have to disclose it? I just...
Can't give it to the party. It's a check off on your income tax return.
So you just automatically get a $100 donation, and...
If I could answer.
Okay.
On your check-off return, it says, do you want to make a political contribution? Yes. Name the parties that you wanted to go to, one or more, or the candidates of the parties, one or more, or to independent candidates. And you check that off. That fund, that data is held by Revenue Canada, and they give the parties a list of the annual contributions they receive, let's say, 90 days at the end of tax year. But they don't give the parties the name and address of the contributor. The idea of this is that you can give $100 to a political party and nobody gets to know. We had a $20 limit for cash contributions that hasn't been changed in, 28 years, 29 years? Okay? Well, look, $100, anonymous contribution, but it's not anonymous to the regulator. It's not anonymous to Revenue Canada. They'll tell you if all the employees of Del Mastro Electric gave $1,000. And you have a problem, by the way, with this stopping people from giving money to employees to then give them to political parties. It's very difficult to get a conviction for breaking that rule. So that's why we said the $1,000 aggregate limit, because if I have 15 employees and I give them each a $1,000 bonus to make political donations and don't tell them how to make it, that amount of money isn't going to affect an election. And again, you reach a limit. That's sort of my answer.
Any comment on government advertising prior to a writ?
There shouldn't be any government advertising, period. I was very pleased with Premier McGuinty when he changed the advertising rule. It was a beautiful thing. No partisan advertising, no spending taxpayers' money spreading BS of any kind, good or bad. The only time is emergency management or crisis management. There's a flood, there's a this or that. That's different. But no. I don't need you to tell me that the pension plan is a great idea if I can jump over a magic bridge. Thanks.
So you support us changing it back to have oversight by the Auditor General?
I would actually want no oversight. It's not allowed, period, except for emergencies, except for essential services. Because you know what? If it's not allowed, we don't have to ask permission, do we? We don't have to sneak around and get under this. Oh, okay, we used pink and green instead of red because that's not our color. But if you look at it in the mirror, sideways, folded over, there's the red. You can find it. It's hidden. Okay? Look. I've been in this game as long as many as you have, okay? And if there is a way to do what we're not allowed to do, we're going to do it. And that's just the truth, all right?
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Ms. Fife.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Vezina, I'm not sure you needed that microphone.
Yeah, well, that's one of 9 kids and deaf in one ear, so hey, that's...
one of our challenges here is to right some wrongs that are contained within this bill, to instill some confidence back in the electoral system. And that's very much connected to money, obviously. Yes. So I was interested to, how did you come up with this $1,000? That's that that's an acceptable level. I mean, you referenced Quebec, which is 100. We are looking at Quebec as well because they're matching funding for political contributions. And you said something about the $100 that wouldn't buy you corruption, but $100,000 would prevent it. So I'm just want to get a better sense of how you came up with your numbers, sir.
Okay. I don't think that we have to go as far as Quebec because, and I'm just being honest here, we didn't have Premier Duplessis, and we didn't have an inbred culture of corruption for generations in Ontario. That's the reality, okay? The problems in Quebec were ignored to the point where it was so criminal that people went to jail, much like the problems in Saskatchewan under the Grant Devine government, okay? So, but it's clear from the OECD study, and it's clear from other studies, the contributions of $1,000 or less generally do not influence policy. But contributions of much more than that do. They start to, okay? So, and I don't think that it's right to tell someone that they can only contribute $100. We thought that for example, if I'm running, as I did in Whitby, Oshawa, and my personal expenses at the end of the campaign have to be declared as a personal contribution. Well, I got myself in trouble in Whitby, Oshawa, because at the end of the day, what ended up as my personal contributions was very, very close to the limit, and I almost went over, okay? And so having if I can only put $1,000 into the game, and I know I can only put $1,000 in the game, period, start, finish, for me, I know what I'm doing as a candidate. And to go raise money, if I can only ask for $1,000 total over the period of the year, and I know you've already been hit up for 500 for this and 300. We think it's a reasonable enough number that it doesn't too restrict the ability of candidates to raise money, parties to raise money, or people to participate in the democratic process.
Okay, and thank you for your comments on government advertising. We have heard concerns, and people get angry, right, when their money is being spent. And this should apply for all parties, all governments going forward, particularly during an election period, wouldn't you say?
The Ontario government violated the Canada Elections Act by doing partisan advertising during the election, federal election.
The federal, yeah.
Okay? I filed a complaint with the Chief Electoral Officer.
Did you?
Okay. They ignored me.
Are you
Unfortunately, there's no obligation on the part of the Chief Electoral Officer to deal with a complaint or to deal with an exigency. Although in Ontario, there's a provision in the Elections Act that allows a Chief Electoral Officer in an exigency to make any ruling he chooses which cannot be appealed to any court. They don't have that right in Russia for the Chief Electoral Officer. We gave it to ours, but he doesn't use it because he can't be compelled to use it.
So you referenced the federal election. Are you referring to the money that was spent on the ORPP advertising during the election?
Yes, and it was during the writ period, and according to federal legislation, it promoted or opposed a candidate or party, and therefore it becomes a campaign contribution and an expense. The Liberal Party was over the campaign limit, and they got around it.
Yeah.
And no regulator will do anything about it, by the way, members here are not from the governing party.
Yeah,
okay?
so, and you filed a complaint?
Yes, and, that's not our issue. We don't deal with that.
So there's no place to formally address that?
I'm going to court. I'm on the way.
You're on your way to court?
Oh, no, I got a human rights complaint over this before the Human Rights Commission, and I have legal documents that are going to get served in a few days. No, this is over. No, I had enough. I've been doing this for 38 years. Do you know how many times before legislative committees I've appeared? I've actually donated this book to this legislature 7 times.
Okay, well, I'll take a copy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll move to the government side. Mr. Dillon.
Thank you very much, Chair. This committee's heard from presenters that Ontario should follow the Quebec donation limits of $100 with matching public funding. What would this mean for your party?
Okay, there's a very good question. Thank you. There's a couple of things. Okay. smaller and newer parties can never compete with the major party. We just can't, right off the bat, okay? And I believe there should be, that's why we proposed $1,000 per candidate that you ran in the previous election, and you can nominate candidates right away for the next election. We propose a regime where there's at least something for a political party to pay a CFO, to rent a mailbox and pay for internet. There's some kind of minimum. But to totally tie the funding of small parties to matching contributions, what that doesn't do is ameliorate the discrimination against a charter class. Fringe parties, according to polls, 98% of Ontarians classify fringe parties as a class of citizens. And it's covered under Human Rights Code, and it's covered under international law. And party finance rules under international law do not allow you to favor one party over another, but they do allow you to put in any limits you want. So the answer to your question is, we don't want a regime that's put in place because you think you have to help us. We can help ourselves. We want a regime that allows us to raise enough money if we run in 122 ridings to compete. And we don't think a $100 limit will do it. If you think about what it would take, and the reason we used 1,000 is there's some magic numbers in here. It takes 5,000 $100 contributions to reach the 50,000 limit for candidates, okay? It takes 50,000 to reach it for parties. If your party's got 50,000 contributors, you deserve the matching funding, but only to the maximum point. So that's my answer.
Okay, thank you. The Green Party doesn't have representation in the legislature, but their leader, Mike Schreiner, he met with the party leaders. Were you part of that meeting?
We were not invited.
You were not invited.
We had to sue the Ontario Election Finances Commission to get invited to Election Finance Commission meetings. And we won, but we haven't sued the Ontario legislature because they haven't let us in to have a say in legislation. Look, it wouldn't be a big deal for when the government did this to invite all the parties, okay? I came anyway, and the other party leaders are going to come anyway. But before the bill was even tabled, you don't just invite your friends. And that's what happens, to be honest. All 20 registered, accredited parties should have been invited to make submissions before we got here, and then to come back after those submissions were made. I believe that's fair.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wong. You have about a minute.
Sorry,
Minute.
it took so
Wow,
long.
I'm going to speak really fast. So thank you very much for being here today. So I just want to get your opinion with regard to the donation limits, especially for independent candidates. As you heard, the proposed Bill 1201 sets a limit to $1,550 to candidate and a maximum of $3,100 for all parties candidate. So in your opinion, should the proposed limit for independent candidates match those of candidates of parties? A donation limit to $1,550 for the candidate as well as for the maximum of $3,100 to all independent candidates. Why and why not?
Okay. Charter of Rights. Everybody's entitled to equal benefit of the law without discrimination.
Okay.
Race, creed, political thought, belief.
So
you
you-
can't have a different rule. Look, the Supreme Court of Canada said in Figueroa that the present political regime we use and the party control of that is not constitutionally protected, and in fact challenging it is constitutionally protected, and then we throw up all these barriers to make sure that no independent candidates will get elected, no new parties will get heard, unless you want to run in 35 elections, and then you might get a chance. So the answer is, you can't be part equal. We're either going to be fair or we're not going to be. There's my answer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Vezina, for coming before committee this morning. Appreciate your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
You're welcome.